In this chapter in the book, I discuss 10 issues that affect women in religious traditions. There are surely other issues that affect women in religious traditions, but these are 10 key issues that I think it's important to examine when you look at the status of women in any given religious tradition. On the left, I list 3 terms that have been used throughout the text. First is distinct gender roles. When gender roles are distinct, that means that there are very different gender roles delineated and attributed to males and females. The second is complementarity. Complementarity is the idea that a man and a woman complete each other when they marry. Complementarity assumes that men and women have different natures, therefore they have different genders or the roles that they form in society, and that a man and a woman should be married in order to complete one another. You can see that the concept of gender complementarity is one of the reasons why very conservative religious people would be against same-sex marriage. The third term is mutuality. And as I've argued earlier, mutuality is what you have when you have two people in a relationship relating to each other as full and complete human beings, each one's own being. So you don't need to have someone of the opposite sex to complete you. You can be a whole human being all in yourself. Then you can be in a relationship with another whole human being, and then there's the give and take that goes along with any relationship. And on the right, I summarize the role of the book concerning gender roles. And you need to be, so whenever you examine any religious tradition, what are the gender roles that religious tradition promotes? Does the religious tradition emphasize distinct gender roles and complementarity? That's for the case, for instance, in terms of the pronouncements coming from the Vatican concerning women. Or does the religion promote mutuality in relationships? So the thesis of the book, again, is that gender roles are influenced first by the available technology to achieve economic survival, and then by the way that men and women divide the labor in order to support the family. In cultures where gender roles are not strongly distinct, women and men both play significant roles in religious activities. In classical patriarchal religions and cultures that have distinct gender roles, the myths, the theologies, and religious laws are used to enforce subordination of women to men. But things start to change if the patriarchal division of labor by sex becomes less rigid because of technological and economic developments and education of women. In that case, women began to assert the necessity of changing or abandoning patriarchal theologies and religious law codes. Women who aspire to or already occupy positions of religious authority, they utilize and they point to past female role models and concepts of female deity or possibly deities to validate themselves in positions of authority. Just as men in patriarchal religions and cultures have often utilized past male role models and conceptions of male deity or deities to validate their authority. In addition to looking at the gender roles that are promoted by a religious tradition, it's also important to look and see what that religion has to say about marriage and divorce. In the religions that are shaped or were shaped in classical patriarchy, and which continue to promote a patriarchal culture, patriarchal society, it is not unusual for women to have no right to divorce their husbands. This is important because if the wife is being abused, then she needs to have a way to get out of that marriage if necessary. So in Judaism, for instance, and also Islam, and in terms of Judaism, we're talking about Orthodox Judaism, and in terms of Islam, we're talking about countries where the Sharia, Islamic law, is enforced. So in either of those two cases, only the husband can divorce his wife. So if she wants to be divorced, she very often she has no right to get that divorce unless he gives it to her. On the other hand, in classical patriarchal traditions, it is usually very easy for a man to divorce his wife. And so, for instance, if it's a very strict Muslim country enforcing Sharia, all a man has to do is say, I divorce you 3 times. Now, he might spread it out, take some time to think about it, or he might just say, I divorce you 3 times all at once. And in Orthodox Judaism, a woman who wants to be free from her husband, a woman who wants to be divorced, she can't have that divorce until he gives her a document called a get, which is her certificate of divorce. And without receiving the get from her husband, if she goes on and has children with another man, her children are considered bastards, and her offspring are considered bastards for several generations. And that would prevent them from marrying someone who was considered to be legitimately born. Another issue is whether or not women have the right to own property. Islam has been revolutionary in this sense, in the sense that women do have the right to own their own property. And when a woman gets married, her husband signs a contract promising to give her an amount of financial property or cash that's called the mahr, M-A-H-R. And the mahr is supposed to provide security to the woman in case something happens to her husband, in case her husband divorces her, or in case her husband dies. So ideally, in the ideal situation, the mahr should be a significant amount. It should be worth a significant amount so that she can either save it or she can invest it in a business and run her own business. But the property or the money that she receives as the mahr is supposed to belong only to her. And so Islam gives women that right. This is contrasted to the situation in many, many Christian countries where a wife could not own property in her own name because everything, as soon as she got married, anything that a woman owned actually belonged to her husband. And that was the case, for instance, in Louisiana. That was the law in Louisiana up until the 1970s. So this slide has a quotation from the Quran about the mahr. And so whether a woman has the right to own property, has the right to inherit property, has the right to give property to her descendants as an inheritance, all of these are a strong indicator of the status of women in that religion. It is also important to look at the myths and doctrines about the cause of the limitations of the human condition to see whether or not these myths and doctrines blame women for these limitations. In a religion that has developed in a patriarchal society, in a religion that ultimately became part of classical patriarchy, it's very common to find myths and doctrines blaming women for the fact that human beings suffer and that human beings die. In Judaism and Christianity, this has been called the fall. The idea that Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden were originally going to be immortal, but they disobeyed God, and that's the fall. And then the punishment is that they are sent out of the Garden of Eden, that men have to work very hard tilling the ground to feed his family from that point on, that women will have a great deal of pain in childbirth, but a woman's desire will be for her husband, nevertheless, despite the pain of childbirth. And the last punishment, according to the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent, is that human beings therefore die. They will return to the dust of the ground from which they were made ultimately. And so the fact that humans die, the finitude of human existence in Judaism and Christianity especially, get blamed on women collectively. Now, I encourage you to read the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent, and that's in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. That story, that myth, does not have to be interpreted in a patriarchal way. But in classical patriarchy, it has been interpreted in sexist ways. And it's not just Judaism and Christianity that does this. Other religions do this as well. It is also important to look to see what the religion has to say about women's bodies. How are women's bodies seen? So in this photograph, I have an image. It's of a goddess that's worshipped in a Hindu temple called the Parashakti Temple, which happens to be in Pontiac, Michigan. And Parashakti means supreme Shakti. Shakti is the power that creates the whole universe. Shakti is considered to be a feminine power. It's a power of women. So Parashakti is the supreme Shakti, the supreme power that creates the whole universe. Another way to say Parashakti is Adi Shakti, which means first Shakti, or another way to say supreme Shakti. And so this image of Parashakti in this Hindu temple is worshiping a goddess, the goddess. She's a great goddess who created the whole universe. She is the whole universe. So, but in Hinduism, in patriarchal Hinduism, and we will study about classical patriarchy in India. So when Hinduism is expressed in a classical patriarchal culture, as it has been expressed for so many hundreds of years, it is acknowledged that yes, all women contain Shakti. Women seem to know how to get things done. They are very active and they can get things done. However, in classical patriarchy, it's also the view that it is very important to control women in order to control their Shakti, to control their power, so that they don't do things such as give birth to illegitimate children. That would be the concern. So different religions will have different views of women's bodies. And I'll just mention here that, again, this is a temple in Pontiac, Michigan. These are Hindus who probably have Western values now. They've probably been influenced by the concept that women and men are supposed to be equal. And so in that case, the concept of Shakti, women's power, the female creative power, can be a resource to promote equality of women. But when you have a great goddess like this in a classical patriarchal society, she might be worshipped, but she's not necessarily a resource for ordinary women living their lives. Female genital mutilation is an issue in a number of very conservative cultures, and when it's carried out, it's usually thought to be necessary to be a good Muslim or to be a good Christian. But in fact, female genital mutilation has nothing to do with Islam or Christianity. Female genital mutilation is a practice that was carried out before Islam came to a country or before Christianity was adopted by a population. But they continue to practice this because the type of Christianity they're practicing or the type of Islam that they're practicing is highly conservative, stresses gender complementarity, and stresses the control of women. In a classical patriarchal society, it's very important for a girl to be a virgin when she gets married. And female genital mutilation of the different types, of the different forms that it takes, is a way to control women's sexuality. I selected this photo because you see that the women, the older women, are the ones who do this. So the mothers, the grandmothers, very often they will call in a woman, possibly a man, but usually a woman who's a specialist who does the cutting. Another factor to examine is whether or not the religion permits or promotes violence against women. In the chapter, I gave the example of the burning times in Europe from the 15th through the 18th centuries. This is a period when Catholics and Protestants hunted witches, tortured people in order to get people to confess to being witches, to get people to name others as witches. And the conservative estimate in terms of the people who were killed is that it was around 50,000, with half of that being killed in German-speaking lands. Most of the violence against so-called witches, alleged witches, was directed against women. 20% of the men were killed, 20% of the total witches, so-called witches were killed were men, but most of them were women over 40. So the burning times then is an example of culturally sanctioned hatred of women. This is called misogyny. And the people who were carrying out this violence were priests and ministers. And there was something about their theology, there were theological beliefs that prompted them to carry out all of this violence. I have a theory. More comparative examples would be needed to determine if it's true, but my theory is that when a society is patrilineal and patrilocal, when the wife goes to live with her husband's family, she is the outsider to that family. Therefore, she poses a danger. She is a potentially dangerous person, and the danger she poses is that she might disrupt the relationships, the family relationships within an extended family. In those types of social situations, it appears to me that women are probably the ones who will be most often suspected of being witches. You have this in Africa, for instance, patriarchal African cultures. And that's contrasted with, for instance, the Apaches, who were matrilineal and matrilocal. They also believed in witches, and they believed in sorcery. That's magic for evil purposes. But in their case, they were more likely to think that men were witches as opposed to women. There are passages in the letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament that stress that it's important for a woman to submit to the headship of her husband. Now, those same passages encourage the husband to love his wife and treat her well. However, in the contemporary period, where you have evangelical Christian families where the husband might be abusive and the wife is wondering what to do. Should she stay? Should she leave? It's not unusual for a pastor to encourage her to stay, because in Paul's letters it says that a wife should submit to her husband. Although there are passages in letters attributed to Paul that say that wives should submit to their husbands, there are no passages in the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible, for instance, that say that God wants husbands, or God gives permission for husbands to beat their wives. However, in the Quran, which is believed to be the literal word of God, it's God speaking in the first person. In the Quran, you have the surah. A surah is a chapter, and it's Surah 4, verse 34, which states that God, Allah, does give permission to a husband to beat his wife if it's warranted. And actually, Muslim husbands have beat their wives, assuming that God gives them this right to do so. So this particular passage, Surah 4, verse 34, is a very difficult passage for the feminist movement, and it's something that feminist Muslims have to address, and they have tried. So far, I have not seen a terribly convincing argument, but some Muslim feminists would argue that this passage is not giving husbands in general the authority to beat their wives, but one argument is that this permission is given to husbands only in the event that that wives as a group refuse to bear children, which I don't see that in this particular passage at all. But the passage does reflect patriarchy. It reflects a social situation of paternalistic dominance where the husband supports the wife financially. And therefore, according to this verse, the wife owes obedience to her husband because he provides the money that economically supports her. So that's a description of paternalistic dominance. So the passage reads that men are in charge of, or they are the overseers of, women, as Allah has given them more. Now, the passage doesn't say more of what. This translator inserted strength. Maybe Allah has given them more economic resources. That would be another way. So as Allah has given them more than the other, and because they, the husbands, spend of their wealth in order to provide for the wives, therefore women who are virtuous are obedient to Allah and guard, in the husband's absence, what God would have them guard. So the obvious thing to be guarded would be her chastity. But also some interpreters say that she's guarding his belongings in the household. And the passage says, "As for those women on whose part you fear rebellion, admonish them and banish them to beds apart and beat them." Or this interpreter says, "and last, beat them. Then, if they obey you, seek not a way against them, for God is most high and great." Reza Aslan, a young Iranian-American scholar of religious studies, points out there is an alternative way of understanding Surah 4, verse 34, and to illustrate this, he points to a translation by Ahmed Ali. And in this translation, you have a completely different meaning from what you have in the earlier type of translation or understanding, in which it is believed that Surah 4 verse 34 gives men permission to beat their wives. In Ali's translation of this verse, it reads, "Men are the support of women, as God gives some more means than others, and because they spend of their wealth to provide for women. As for women you feel are averse, talk to them suasively, then leave them alone in bed without molesting them, and go to bed with them whenever they are willing." So, according to this translation, the advice being given here in the Quran is not to pressure women, wives, to have sex unless they are willing. In other words, leave them alone until they might be willing. I think this type of translation is relevant for the time in which the verses of the Quran were revealed, which was a time of warfare when women were taken as captives and slaves, and some of them were married by the Muslim men who captured them. The systematic violence against girls and women in various countries is found in countries that have a very skewed sex ratio. And this was highlighted in 1990 by Dr. Amartya Sen, who is an economist, and he wrote an article entitled "More than 100 Million Women Are Missing." And he points out that the normal sex ratio in a country where health care is equal should be 105 to 106 women to every 100 men. The reason is that girl babies are hardier than boy babies, and women live longer than men. In China alone, there are 50 million women missing. And it's also estimated that there's probably another 50 million women missing in India. So when you see a very skewed sex ratio where you have a very low number of females to the number of males, then something's going on. In the past it was female infanticide. Now it seems to be the abortion of female fetuses so that another pregnancy can occur, and they hope that it'll be a boy in the subsequent pregnancy. And also there's the issue of the mortality of mothers, especially if they've been subjected to extreme surgical procedures such as infibulation, which is the most extreme type of female genital mutilation. Here are just some of the statistics per country, their sex ratios as they were determined in 2012. And you can see that France, Japan, and interestingly Guatemala have a correct sex ratio. The United States is okay, but it's a little bit below that with 103 women to every 100 men. And Kazakhstan seems to have very long-lived women. They have about 108 women to every 100 men. But over in the left-hand column, you see very low sex ratios. You have anywhere from 93 to 98 women to 100 men. And that means that something is being done actively to reduce the number of females in the society. The next issue to consider when you're examining a religious tradition to determine women's status in that religion is the issue of women as religious specialists. And there are different types of religious specialists. And the next slide we'll talk about women as ordained or credentialed religious leaders. Here we're going to talk about women who become shamans. But first you need to pay attention in the chapter to the description of basic religion. What do I mean by basic religion? The various characteristics of basic religion are discussed in the chapter. The underlying worldview in what I'm calling a basic religion is what scholars call animism. And animism involves two types of beliefs. The first is the belief that there is an impersonal force or multiple forces underlying everything in nature and also within human beings. And the second belief is that these forces take on personal expressions as spirits, either good or bad spirits. And there are different types of spirits, but they can include the ancestors and the gods and goddesses, of course. So animism is the underlying worldview. And if you, in a basic religion, or sometimes frequently these types of religions are called indigenous religions. So in a basic religion or an indigenous religion, it is believed to be very important for all human beings, all persons, to be in harmony with the beings and the forces that are unseen, but are nevertheless all around human beings and in nature. And so if something bad is happening to someone, if there's a lot of misfortune in one's life or the life of the family, then they want to find out, well, what force am I out of harmony with? What God or spirit or ancestor is angry at me? And what do I need to do to get back in harmony with these unseen forces and beings? And the person they consult is what scholars call a shaman. So shaman is a term that originates from peoples living in Siberia, but scholars have applied this term shaman to these types of figures in various cultures. Of course, in their own societies, they'll have their own languages and their own names for this particular role. But a shaman is an individual who is believed to serve as an intermediary between human beings and the spirits, the gods, and the ancestors, so that communities or individuals may preserve or regain harmony with sacred forces and beings. Shamanism is based on charisma, so this is another term to note its meaning. Charisma is the belief that someone has access to an unseen source of authority. That unseen source of authority will be the forces, the spirits, the ancestors. And so the shaman is the one who is in touch with those unseen forces and beings. Charisma, the belief that someone is in touch with unseen forces and beings, is always socially constructed. That means that no one has charisma unless people believe that that woman or that man has access to these unseen sources of authority. So a shaman is believed to gain knowledge by contacting spirits or gods or ancestors through a variety of means, including what scholars call traveling shamanism, possession shamanism, or psychic shamanism. So these are different types of shamanism that have been delineated by scholars. In this slide, you have the definition of charisma that I gave in the previous slide. It's when people believe that someone has access to an unseen and sacred source of authority. There are different types of charisma. What might be called extraordinary charisma is when people believe that direct revelation is available only to the leader and not accessible to other members of the group. So extraordinary charisma is charisma authority that's based on some sort of unseen source that's restricted to a particular leader or perhaps a minority of leaders. What we can call shared charisma is when you have the experiences of sacred forces and there are multiple people, there are multiple members in the group who have these experiences. So, in other words, charisma access to an unseen source of authority is not restricted to one person, but it's shared among members in the group. And then on the right side, you have the different types of shamans that I mentioned in the previous slide. A traveling shaman is when you have the belief that the soul of the shaman leaves the body to travel in the spirit world and consults the spirits. And Dr. Robert Elwood is the person who coined this phrase, traveling shaman. Then you also have possession shamans, and this term also comes from Robert Elwood. And a possession shaman is someone who is believed to have the spirits, or perhaps several spirits, come into his or her body during trance and actually speaking through the shaman's mouth. So for instance, in African religions or African-derived religions, when a person is possessed, he or she dances like that spirit, wears clothes like that spirit, eats food favored by the spirit, drinks things that are favored by the spirit, and when that person speaks, he or she is speaking the words coming from that particular spirit that's possessing. Then lastly, I've coined this term psychic shaman because this is the type of religious revelation, religious experience that's very common among Native Americans. And that's when you have a religious specialist who receives information from the spirit world through visions and dreams or intuitions. And actually, this type of shamanism, the psychic shaman, is very much a shared charisma in a number of Native American religious traditions. This is a photograph of Robert Elwood. He is a historian of religions. He's retired from teaching at University of Southern California. And more than 20 years ago, he encouraged me to write this book. So he's one of the people that I dedicate the book to. And apparently he was visiting a place where you had butterflies. And when this butterfly landed on his beard, sitting on the side of his face. Erica Bourguignon, and I'm probably mispronouncing her name, but she is an anthropologist who has studied many different types of shamanism, and she has a book on possession. And she writes that possession shamanism seems to be associated with early socialization to accept hierarchical authority. And it appears to me that this is the case. She also says that childhood socialization geared to producing independent and self-reliant individuals within a predominantly classless society is not conducive to experiences that the society will interpret as possession trance. And I agree with this observation also. The society that I have studied the most would be the Apaches, and we'll be studying the Apaches in the next book. And possession is just not part of their culture, their traditional culture, and they were definitely, when they were living their traditional lifestyle in the deserts of northern Mexico, southern New Mexico, and southern Arizona, the children were definitely taught and socialized to be self-reliant individuals. And society was a predominantly classless society. Star Sarad is an anthropologist who's written about different types of women's religious leadership with a particular eye toward shamanism as empowering women to become religious specialists. And she distinguishes between specialist possession, which is when the ability to contact the spirits is not widely shared, and other types of possession, which I called shared possession. That's when many people have access to the possession. In African culture, in African societies where you have possession shamanism practiced, They will belong to worship groups. Anthropologists call these worship groups cults. A cult is just a worship group, that's all it is. And so people will belong to worship cults in which virtually everybody becomes possessed, or you will be initiated in and ultimately become a what I call a possession priest. So that's an example of shared possession. Sarah theorizes that one's experience of pregnancy and also sexual intercourse makes women more comfortable with the idea of sharing their bodies with another being. However, we need to note that men in various cultures are often possession shamans. So it's not just the women who are possession shamans. However, very often women will tend to predominate in numbers as the possession shamans. Sarah theorizes that in patriarchal society, the son's need to separate from his mother to achieve masculine gender identity leads to men more likely having soul traveling experiences in terms of shamanism. In the history of religions, it is in fact men who seem to be most often reported as having soul traveling shaman experiences. The most famous is Muhammad, and Muhammad is described as being in Mecca and dreaming, and that he was flying on the back of a steed named Burak, and the steed has the body of a horse and the head of a man, and that they fly from Mecca to Jerusalem, and they touch down on a rock, a very sacred rock, on the top of Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and then they ascend to heaven, where Muhammad speaks directly with Allah and learns how many times Muslims are supposed to pray each day. He got the number 5. So, although this was a dream, or it started out as a dream, Muhammad, when he woke up, is described as giving details about what Jerusalem at that time looked like, and people recorded these details, and then somebody traveled to Jerusalem and confirmed that what he saw was actually there. So Muslims regard this as an example of Muhammad actually, his soul actually traveling from Mecca to Jerusalem, then going up to heaven to speak with Allah, and the soul traveling experience took place while he was asleep. The chapter discusses shamans in Korea. They're called mudang, and most of the mudang are women, although some are men. And in past decades, because it was considered a woman's role to be a mudang, a man who was a mudang had to dress like a woman, although that is not the case any longer, and that shows a change in gender roles in Korean society. One is called to be a mudang as a possession shaman by suffering possession sickness for a long time. And then the only way to recover is to be initiated as a mudang and then to function as a mudang, to let the gods and the spirits speak through her. And so the mudang becomes a ritual specialist performing rituals to placate and promote harmony with the different Korean gods and spirits. And behind this particular mudang, you see paintings of the different Korean gods and spirits that she channels. Now, some mudang are hereditary mudang, and so instead of going through possession sickness, they learn the rituals and they learn the mythology from, for instance, their mothers. So there are 2 types of mudang. One is just completely a ritual specialist, in other words, a priest, And the other is a shaman who went through possession sickness, became a shaman, an initiated mudang, and she also serves as a ritual specialist, in other words, a priest. Possession shamanism is very important for women in highly patriarchal cultures because if people believe that you are possessed by a spirit, then you gain a voice. You're able to say things that otherwise the society is telling you that you can't say. And you're not blamed for speaking frankly about your personal problems or speaking frankly about problems of your neighbors, for instance, things that they would rather keep private, because you're not the woman, you're not the one who is actually saying these things. It's the spirit possessing you that is actually saying these things. So possession shamanism is very important because it actually gives women a voice. Now, ostensibly, the women are unconscious of what they're saying, but it does give women a chance to articulate things that they have on their minds. And although this sounds very strange, this was the case also in the United States. Up until the mid 19th century, and even after that, women were not supposed to speak in public. It was considered immoral for women to speak to mixed audiences. So Anne Browdy is a scholar of religion in America. She published this important book on the women who became mediums. In other words, they were the mediums in seances, and they were channeling the spirits of the dead. And they also became public speakers in auditoriums. A spiritualist medium would sit on a stage and presumably go into a trance and then start speaking about social, political, and philosophical matters, things that women were not supposed to be talking about and were definitely not supposed to be articulating them on a stage in front of an audience. So Anne Browdy says that the mediums were the first sizable group of women in the United States to speak publicly, and this all took place in the 1850s. So when you have a very strongly patriarchal culture, it's possession that gives women a voice. And this is not to say that the women don't believe that they are possessed. They do believe that they are possessed. They do believe that they are possessed by spirits. Their illnesses that they're suffering in terms of possession sickness, those are real. But then when they are diagnosed as being possessed, and then they're taught how to control and channel the possession, then they are healed. And many of them gain a profession because if they can contact the spirits and tell people how to be in harmony with the spirits, then they start to receive customers. They have clients who come to see them. And once the shaman starts earning money, the roles of the family members, the roles in the marriage are reversed, where the woman might be earning money as a shaman or a medium, and perhaps the husband is now taking care of the house and the children. And in the case of East Asian countries, perhaps the mother-in-law ends up running the household and serving the daughter-in-law, which completely reverses the way it's supposed to be in East Asian classical patriarchy.